All right, welcome, Security Simplified Podcast listeners. This is episode 12. Joining me is my good friend, Ryan Cloutier. Say hey, Ryan.
Hey, Ryan.
Awesome. So, in case you haven't noticed, we've been gone for a little while. We haven't recorded an episode since January 20th, 2022. We've been busy, but other than that, we put together, I think, a really good podcast series for you. We have a 9-part podcast series. We are going to keep it simple, high level, keep it to our short format. And we're going to talk about incident management. So we've got an incident management series to talk about. What do you think, Ryan?
I think it's a really good conversation to have, and it's an important piece, right? It's probably one of the more important pieces to a healthy and functional security program.
Yeah, I agree with that, man. I talk about incident response a lot. I don't know. It's been a long time since I think I've done a podcast on it. So I'm excited to do that. I'm sharing the screen right now. So if people are watching the video that we post on YouTube, that's fine. Otherwise, we'll talk through it. So if you're a podcast listener, not a podcast watcher, the slide deck that I have up is from our CVCISO class, our Certified Virtual Chief Information Security Officer course that we recently put together, Security Studio put together. Now, our incident management series is a 9-part series. I'm just going to read through it quick, and then we're going to build some logic. You and I, Ryan, we're going to help people build the case for why you need an incident management program. Sound good?
Sounds great.
All right. So the 9-part series is first today. We're going to talk about support for incident response. How do you build that support? How do you do it without fear? Because I think, fear is something we've oversold in this industry. So we're going to go straight with logic. So you can use, depending on who it is you're trying to make the case to, you can go either way. The second part of the series is going to be busting the most common information or incident management myths. We've done enough incident management work over the years. We've heard pretty much all of them. So we're going to bust those. We'll talk about the most common incident management mistakes in the third episode, and then we'll go into the fourth episode, the most common incident management questions. This is always interesting because in every incident response, you get questions from executive management, from others on your team, sometimes just client members. So those are always interesting. And then we'll go into building. So hopefully by the first 4 episodes, we've built a pretty good case for why we really need to have an incident management program. The last 5 episodes are all about building it. So the first one is going to be reporting. So here we're thinking about what comes into the incident management process. Right? So when I say reporting, somebody's got to report an incident. We have to become aware of it before we're going to be able to do anything with that. So how do we put that into a plan? Then we'll go into logging, not logging like the inputs, but logging like we need to log the incident. We have a rule in incident management that if you're going too fast to document everything, you're going too fast. So that'll be an interesting episode. Then we'll talk about triage and escalation. So you triage an incident, meaning collect some information to kind of help guide where you're going to take it. In some cases, you escalate, sometimes you don't. So we'll talk through that. Then it's response and investigation, and then we'll wrap it up with lessons learned. This particular series I'm excited about because I've been in so many incident responses. It's a lot of fun for me to talk about, and this will take us all the way through till almost the end of April. So we have about 2 months of this, 9 episodes. All right, so first, building support for an incident response, incident management. Now, for some of us in this industry, some of us who are in information security, it's so obvious, right? Well, how could you not have an incident management plan or program? But the sad news is more than half of the organizations out there don't. And so it must not be obvious to some. And unfortunately, I think a lot of those organizations that don't have an incident management plan or program are your customers, they're your partners, they're your vendors. So It also helps us in all parts of the other parts of the program. Certainly, with third-party information security risk management, ask your vendors if they have an incident response plan. If they do, or if they say they do, then ask to see it.
Hmm.
You can evaluate it yourself based on the things we talk about in this series. All right, so first I'm going to start with the logic, and you should see it on the screen. Ryan, you see it?
I see something on the screen. Yes,
Something? What do you mean? It's words. It's a slide deck, isn't it? Do you
I
see
do
the
see
slide
where
deck?
I
Okay.
do.
And like I said, this comes from chapter 2, lesson 4 of the CVCISO course that we put together. And I start with just in building logic, information security is. So what is information security? Let's just start there. And so we walk through that. Let me go ahead and move the screen forward for us. So information security is risk management of unauthorized disclosure, modification, and destruction of information using administrative, physical, and technical controls. Now, you may have a slightly different definition of information security, but it shouldn't be contradictory to this one. Would you agree with that, Ryan?
Yeah, I think that any definition needs to touch on these key points. There's different ways to phrase it, but you absolutely have to touch on these key points because that's what it is, right? It is risk management. It's not some technical wizardry. And what are we managing the risk of? We're managing the risk of disclosure, modification, or destruction of the information that we're, charged with protecting. Um, and generally, we're going to go about doing that with administrative, physical, and technical controls.
Yeah. So the person, and we've talked about this before, and we've seen this debated so many times. Who's ultimately responsible for this? Who's ultimately responsible for information security in an organization? It's the board of directors. It's the CEO. Whoever sits at the top of the food chain.
Mm-hmm.
This is their responsibility ultimately. And so this may be your definition of information security. It's really important for you to document that, and it's really important for you to share that, right? Because if the person who's ultimately responsible for information security doesn't agree with it, well, then you have to reconcile, right? I mean, it has to start there. We could talk incident management all day long, but if we don't even have an agreement on what information security is, we need to back it up. All right, so that's part of our logic. That's what it is. If you can get agreement on that, well, then let's go through the risk management. What is risk management? That's another part I think we just take for granted in our industry. We say all the time we speak a different language. So I have my definition of risk management. Does the person who's ultimately responsible or the body who's ultimately responsible, do they have the same definition? Again, it's important for us to walk through this. So let's take risk, for instance. What is risk? To me, risk is the likelihood of something bad happening and the impact if it did. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward. Ryan, your definition, I assume, is pretty close to the same.
It is. In the purest sense, the definition of risk is likelihood and impact. There are different perceptions around that, but that's another podcast for another day.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, I agree. And this is also another, I think, passionate subject for both you and I to talk about is what is risk? How do you manage risk? How do you assess it and all that good stuff? But so from our logic, information security is risk management. This is what risk is, the likelihood of something bad happening, the impact if it did. There's no such thing as a positive risk. Risk is always based on something bad, right? So that bad thing that happens, let's circle that, right, in our logic. So we're talking about an incident being a bad happening, a bad thing that's happened.
Mm-hmm.
That's our definition of an incident. So let's take management then. Risk management. Risk is that the likelihood of something bad happening, the impact if it did. We tied that now to a bad thing happening is an incident, right? Our logic is flowed, and we can see that on the diagram. So then management. Let's break down management. It's important to note because I think some executives, some people in our industry think the goal here is risk elimination. Not possible.
Right.
Can't be. And you can walk through that with, and I've had this same discussion with bank presidents before, because I'm thinking of one bank president in particular. He said, well, we don't need an incident management plan. And so I said, okay, so you can guarantee then that nothing bad is going to happen. He's like, well, of course not. Well, therefore, right, we need That's why we have it. Uh, so anyway, because risk elimination is impossible, and that's, on the diagram, that's exactly what I've got pointed out. Can you claim, if you don't agree that risk management is the goal and it's not risk elimination, then can you guarantee me that nothing bad will happen? And the answer is absolutely not. Well,
Right.
therefore, we can't claim that we will not have an incident. We will have bad things happen, period.
Well, and,
So,
and part of that, just to add to that, this is the important part where, it starts with a conversation. And you'll hear Evan and I say this all the time, right? We got to level set that language. We've got to level set that conversation, because getting on the same page at the beginning makes the rest of the process much, much simpler, less painful. And the reality is the lack of having this plan in advance means that you're going to be figuring this out on the fly. And an incident, if you've lived through one, is catastrophic and chaotic enough by itself with a good plan, let alone if you don't have one. If you don't have one, you're just scrambling like mad. So one of the things, if you are struggling to articulate the value of why this conversation needs to happen, you can tie it back to business terms, and it'll help us to respond quicker. It will help us to limit the amount of damages and financial expenditures, because we've planned for what to do, so we don't waste that time figuring out what to do. We already have a plan in place for it.
exactly. And exactly. And at some point, so the logic then holds that an incident is an absolute certainty. Would you agree?
100%. You are going to experience an incident if you are using computing. It's going to happen.
So the logic takes us there, and now a little bit of fear, because I think one of the things that executive management, boards of directors fear maybe the most in business is liability,
Hmm.
being negligent. So if opposing counsel were to depose you, so when an incident does happen, typically it's not criminal, it's a civil matter in most cases. So opposing counsel is going, you're being sued. Now, the way getting sued works is it's a preponderance of evidence, right? There's no proof beyond a reasonable doubt. It's tip the scale one way in one person's favor. They're the ones who end up winning the case. So imagine being deposed by opposing counsel and being asked the same thing. Here's the logic, right? An incident is an absolute certainty. Then why didn't you plan for it? You knew it was going to happen eventually, didn't you? It becomes a really, I think, uncomfortable position. And us as security people, we're not the ones who are supposed to be making the risk decisions.
Right.
We have two jobs. One is to consult the business to make good risk decisions. And the second part is to implement those risk decisions to the best of our ability. So if I haven't had this discussion with executive management or the board of directors, what kind of consultant am I? I don't want to be deposed on that.
Right.
So, and that's, pure logic. And as you walk somebody through a diagram like this, if they find places where there's a gap in the logic or it's illogical, what a great opportunity for us to have a discussion then. Because this is held true forever. I mean, at least in the 30 years I've been in this industry. So this is what we plan for. We plan for that absolute certainty. We don't know when it's going to happen. We don't know exactly how it's going to happen. But we do know that we can have a plan for it. So the logic then just kind of fills in. What we know that information security is risk management. Therefore, we cannot prevent all bad things from happening. What we cannot prevent, we must be able to detect. And when we detect it, we better have a response for it. Even your lack of a formal incident response is a response. You're going to do something. Will that something be what a reasonable person does, or will that something be, what an unreasonable person does? Again, I'm not a lawyer, but I've just worked too much with them. Maybe one time is too much. But it's the prudent man rule, right? what would a prudent person do in the same situation? We don't want to be the imprudent person.
Well, and I almost think of it as a form of insurance, if you will,
Yeah.
right? There's many ways when you're having this conversation with a non-technical person to tie this back to things they already understand. Fire drills. Why do we do them? Every one of us that's worked at an office has had at some point, if the office is big enough, to do a fire drill. Not because we live in constant fear the office is going to burst into flames, but because we know the likelihood of a fire is not zero, and if it happens, it could be really bad, and we need to get our people out. And this is the same thing. This isn't about living in fear. This isn't about, the sky is falling. It's to Evan's point, it's the absolute certainty that at some point on the continuum, you're going to have some type of incident. It may vary in severity, it may vary in impact, but what's not going to change is the fact that you're going to have it, and then you're going to have to do something about it. And I know, a well-formed response plan can shave literal hours and tens of thousands of dollars off of your response.
It can save a business.
It can. It can be the difference between staying in business and going out of business. It's how quickly you handle it, how well you handle it, and what you do next. So, the key here is to solidify around this and talk in those logical terms, and then work with your stakeholders to understand what they understand. And if there's gaps, keep doing that. Don't plop a plan down in front of them yet. Don't even get into the details yet. Keep working until you have agreements that, yes, we should have some kind of preparedness. Now, most of these same organizations will have some semblance of a disaster recovery plan. Well, an incident response plan properly designed and executed can sometimes prevent the need to have to activate that disaster recovery plan, but they're in the same vein of preparedness. And that's maybe how you have to tie this together for your business, to say, hey, we have insurance, not because we're worried this is going to happen tomorrow, but it could. We have smoke alarms and sprinklers and all these other things that we have in the event of. This is just one more thing that falls in that continuum.
Well, the fact of the matter is, if you don't have an incident response plan, it's illogical.
It is, and I would argue.
Because here's the logic right here. If you can't argue against this logic, if you're going against it, that's the definition of illogical.
Well, in 2020.
Yeah, exactly. So it looks like we lost Ryan briefly. But we're towards the end of the show anyway. He must have clicked a button that he didn't intend to click. We'll wrap it up here real quick. Well, he's joining us again. What did you do?
I don't know. Google.
Stop Googling. So
Chrome choked on me.
Well, that's all right. I was just finishing up the podcast anyway. So not having an incident response plan is illogical, right? So we could use the fear thing. We can certainly use statistics all day long and say, X percent of organizations that don't have an incident response plan never recover, or whatever you want to do. That stuff is already, Google it, right? And it's out there. It's so sold. And for some people, obviously it didn't resonate because, like I said, more than half the organizations out there don't have an incident response plan. So either they just have their head buried in the sand or they don't care. Our job is to consult them to make good risk decisions. It's not a good risk decision to not have an incident response plan, period.
I would agree.
All right, so that's that. Next episode, we're going to be episode 13. We'll get into the most common incident response myths. So I think we did an okay job today in building the case for an incident response plan, an incident management plan or program. Brian, do you have anything to close out with?
Just to say that this really is, if you don't have this today, this is something to definitely spend time and energy on. And the more personal you can make the connection before you get to the details, the easier it's going to be to get that buy-in and support from your leadership. Right? Speak their language, don't speak yours. And if you need any tips on that, feel free to hit us up on the various social medias. We're happy to give some coaching on how best to approach a difficult or resistant leader.
Absolutely. All right. For Ryan and I and all the folks over here at Security Studio, we thank you for listening.